This is apropos. Now is not the time to change president, says Emmanuel Macron's outgoing prime minister, as the head of state faces mounting calls for snap elections. 2 days after announcing his decision to resign, Sébastien Lecornu says he believes that prospect appears to have receded. The Élysée has tonight confirmed that the president will announce a new prime minister within the next 48 hours. It comes after Lecornu held 2 days of last-ditch talks with political opponents to try to diffuse the current crisis and build support for a new budget. But he appears to have made little progress.
I can assure you that this is not the time to change the president, because by definition, France's voice abroad, and with the governmental instability we've been experiencing for the past year, fortunately, the president is France's image abroad. Now, I'm not talking about him personally, you know how loyal I am to him, but I'm talking about his role. And so the presidential institution needs to be protected and preserved.
For more on what might happen next, we're joined by Joseph Downing, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at Aston University. Joseph, thanks so much for being with us on the programme. Now is not the time to change presidents, as the outgoing Prime Minister. Is he right?
Well, I mean, they don't have to change outgoing presidents currently. I mean, that's one of the key issues that France is facing, because Macron can hang on. However, it's quite clear that the sharks are indeed circling around Macron. I mean, the latest that we're going to see a presidential election is 2027, which sounds far away, but actually isn't, right? It's only a couple of years. And while a lot can change in politics in, 2 weeks, I don't think that France is going to get a grip anytime soon on its budgetary woes. And I think it's likely that things will get worse. So the Macron's key political rivals are smelling blood in the water and seeing that it's best for them to now not cooperate with him, so that they can present a clean slate and a clean manifesto for the 2027 elections. However, it might not be time for a change in president, and there may not be no sort of legal obligation necessarily, but if Macron keeps nominating prime ministers who then go on to lead governments which collapse, I mean, there may not be many options left. I think, the only option before we go to the point where we have to have presidential elections are parliamentary elections, which are very, very unlikely, I would say, to deliver any more clarity to Macron. So, I mean, he's really in a tough situation.
Yeah, and that is the big problem, isn't it? Opinion polls suggesting that over 3/4 of people here do actually want Macron to resign. But wouldn't a new president face exactly the same problems?
Of course, no, 100%. I mean, and that's the key issue. However, they will pretend that they won't, and that's the key issue here with the polarization in French politics that we've seen over the past 10 or so years, as we've seen a massive polarization towards the far left and the far right, neither of who have any experience in government whatsoever, which for them is actually a strength right now, right? Because they don't have a track record that they have to defend. And they've made the most ridiculous utopian promises to French voters that French voters seem to be believing. So they will face very, very similar problems. And in fact, if not worse problems, because it's likely that an election of a far right or a far left, both of whom are in different ways reasonably Eurosceptic, reasonably anti-globalization, would massively rattle the financial markets, would push French bond yields up even higher. I mean, for the first time this year, the French price that France is paying to borrow was higher than Italy's for a while, which is unprecedented territory for France in the 21st century. And so they would probably actually have an even worse situation to grapple with than Macron. But in politics, that doesn't really matter. What matters is perceptions and what you can promise. And right now, because they don't have a track record to defend, they can kind of promise the world. And that's exactly what they're doing. And they're promising to, in fact, up welfare spending and lower the retirement age, all of which to us just seems a little bit insane, right? Given that that's really some of the cruxes of the issue. But if you're in opposition and you don't have a track record, you can promise really whatever you want. I mean, we saw that in the UK with the promises made around the Brexit referendum, and none of whom have materialised. And that's the problem with politics, I think, and one of the kind of key weaknesses of democracies is that when you're out of office, you can promise the world, but when you get into office, you very rarely can deliver it.
And as for Macron himself, he's now as unpopular, really, as his predecessor was. He's respected internationally, though. So why has he fallen so far from grace?
I mean, it's what I often discuss as the sort of the paradox of French reform, right? I mean, if you do opinion polls in France, reform and the need to reform France, it does garner an amount of support. And if you speak to French people, they'll say, "Oh, the status quo is no good and things need to change." But the problem is, people don't want to make sacrifices for that change, and thus it puts any leader that comes in an extremely difficult position. And Macron came in as a reformer, which, I mean, everyone can get behind the idea of reform, until it means reform to their own privileges, or until it means a kind of reform that perhaps they don't specifically agree with. And this really is I think, has been one of his key problems. And I also think it's France is a very difficult nut to crack, right? To be a popular politician, any president stands in the shadows of some of the greats of 20th century global politics, Chirac, Mitterrand, and most notably General de Gaulle. So it's very difficult, I think, for French presidents to be popular and to make a mark. Also, Macron has known for being quite aloof, being coming across as quite arrogant. His manner with people and with voters is not very sympathetic. Also, there's questions, I think, about his private life. I mean, that there are the ridiculous conspiracy theories circulating in the US that Brigitte Macron is indeed not a woman, but actually a biological man, which again sounds insane, but has gained a lot of traction online. And I think the fact that he's not your classic French president with a younger wife, with children, that possibly goes around having affairs. There is just something about him that I just think doesn't sit well with people personally. And I think that combined with, a reasonably controversial political stance on reform, just it isn't really a great mix. However, I don't think he's done a particularly bad job. I mean, in power, he's faced a lot of really, really difficult challenges, and in fact, generational defining challenges, right? I mean, we're talking difficulties of that magnitude, the COVID pandemic, Brexit, the war in Ukraine, the inflationary crisis and the cost of living crisis that, most advanced democracies are facing. And I don't think he's done particularly bad. And I don't think by global standards, his reforms are particularly that contentious. It's just within the context of France, his, mannerisms and his kind of, non-typical family setup, shall we say, I think causes him some considerable issues. However, I do think in the future, people will look back almost nostalgically at Macron, because I don't think what's coming next, whatever that may look like, is necessarily going to work that well either.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you how he will be remembered when he eventually does leave office. But how responsible do you think he is for the current crisis, Joseph?
Not that responsible. I mean, this is the problem, right? I mean, most major democracies have huge levels of debt, right? But this is not something that the current incumbent leadership has caused. This has been going on since the sort of latter half of the 20th century. I mean, we could say something similar. Germany's not in such a dire position, but it still has a lot of debt. The US, we can see, as currently a government shutdown because of the deficit. We can see and the inability to agree a budget. We can see the UK is having problems. Italy, I mean, this is everywhere, right? And this is not Macron's fault, as it's not Keir Starmer's fault, or indeed Donald Trump's fault. This is something that's been going on now for some considerable time, and nobody has a simple, viable answer, right? I mean, Macron's take on this is we need austerity and we need to cut spending, we need to hike taxes. That's quite unpopular. Even some economists argue that is counterproductive, because it will stunt economic growth. But I just don't see a kind of simple way out of this pickle. And no politician across the democratic world or even beyond has a simple solution. Javier Milei was elected in Argentina to deal with huge deficits and much worse economic problems than France faces. He hasn't been able to figure this out either. So I don't think Macron necessarily deserves the blame. I mean, France's debt has also only ballooned since COVID, and I think we can see something across Europe where, things like healthcare expenses, inflation, increasing numbers of people on out of work, social security haven't come down since COVID really in any meaningful way, and I think this is causing, a lot of really significant issues. I also think he has done quite well internationally. I mean, France is going through a very difficult time internationally as well, losing some of its influence, or as some would say, sort of neo-colonial relationships with states in the Sahel and West Africa, where Russian propaganda and sort of quite shady military coups have taken place, and Macron has been able to reassert France's role on both the European and the global stage. He's done a much better job than Sarkozy or Francois Hollande ever did.
But could the
So yes, I
current
think it's a
political
difficult.
Sorry for
Sorry.
cutting across you, but could the current political crisis, though, have been averted if he hadn't called those snap elections last year?
Oh yeah, 100%. No, no, no. I mean, this is one of the things, right? This is one of this will be the mistake I think that will mark his legacy, right? Because calling those snap elections was a gamble that he thought he could win. Once again, feeding into that sense that there's something a little bit aloof and arrogant and out of touch about the man, which was a gamble that did not pay off, right? Which was a gamble that saw his share of the parliament reduced. It saw voters flock to the fringes of the left and the right, which is exactly not what he needed at that point. I mean, there are centrist forces on the centre left and the centre right that are much more amenable to working with Macron, who have a record in government, who who he could rely on to be a little bit more sane and sensible than the far left and the far right. And then I think that really is the mistake that will be seen as perhaps the largest mistake of his presidency.
Time will tell. Joseph, thank you so much for being with us on the programme. That is Joseph Downing, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at Aston University.